It's Pastor Wanzell here, and I am so excited to be before you again this week. I'm especially excited, though, because today is my best friend's birthday, my girlfriend's birthday, my partner's birthday. She my wife, too. Do me a favor and wish Pastor Tina a happy birthday. Blow her up on social media and make sure that she feels some love today because the girl getting old, y'all. But I still love her. If you don't mind, let's turn to the book of Mark, chapter 8, verse 22, the NIV version. We got a little work to do there today, and then we'll push from there. Mark, chapter 8, verse 22, the NIV version. I'll read for you. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Verse 25. Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't even go into the village." Our topic for discussion today is the phrase leaving the limits. Say that with me, leaving the limits. As you know, the past few months, just like every other church, we've been about 100% virtual ever since the coronavirus caused us to go to a virtual platform. And it was new opportunities for us. I'll put it like that, because we hadn't had a big virtual presence before then, meaning doing calls, doing these videos. We didn't do much of that, and it was a learning curve for us. I remember when we first rolled this out, we were doing a Zoom call with the men's movement group. And if you haven't been part of a movement group, you need to join one. But we had done we're doing one of our first calls with the movement group, and we get this message that pops up and says, "You've got 5 minutes before this call will drop." So you know how men are. We're going to push the envelope and we're going to go as far as we can go. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. And sure enough, 5 minutes comes and the call drops. What we didn't know at the time that we had wrote this thing out was that we had a limited version of the application. We had a limited version. It gave you so much time to have a call. And it wasn't the company's fault that we were experiencing those difficulties and it dropped our call, because our conversation was great, but it had to end earlier because we signed up for a limited version. They could meet our needs, no problem. They had everything that we needed, but what we needed to do was just sign up for an unlimited version. I believe in this season that God wants us to move away from a limited version of faith. I think he wants us to move away from a limited version of giving. He wants us to move away from a limited version of believing. He wants us to get the full version of what he has available to us. I believe that God is working desperately in this season to try to move us away from the self-induced limitations that we've placed on him. And he wants us to get the full version because it's available to us. All we have to do is say, "God, we're willing." I want to look at this man's story and get a few points from it, and then I'll let you go. Let's go to verse 22. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and he led him out of the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" I want you to notice that when they bring this blind man to Jesus, which is a commendable act. I mean, they bring someone who desperately needs Jesus, but they ask Jesus to touch the blind man, not to heal the blind man. They just ask for a touch. They know what they want from Jesus, but they want it done a certain way. They want to dictate the method by which Jesus does this thing. And without even responding, Jesus just grabs the man by the hand and takes him outside the city limits. He gets him outside of those boundaries. And my first point for you today is limited systems. Write that down. Limited systems. Jesus was very familiar with Bethsaida. It was the hometown of Peter, Philip, and Andrew. It was a town where Jesus had performed many miracles, but it was also the same town that Jesus denounced. He condemned the place. You see, Jesus would come to Bethsaida and he would perform all these miracles, but it wasn't producing any faith. The city never repented. And when I see Jesus taking this man by the hand and leading him outside of the city, taking him outside of the city limits, it is symbolic of him taking him away from systems that wanted to limit the effect of Jesus, of what Jesus wanted to do in this man's life. He takes him away from systems and ways of thinking that was going to limit what Jesus could do. I believe in 2020, God is taking the church outside of its limits. He's taking the church outside of the four walls and the limits of the church. He's taking our society beyond the limits of discrimination. He's taking us beyond the limits of our financial resources because he wants us to experience the full version of him. And we can't experience the full version of God until we get outside of the systems that we've created for ourselves, that we've placed on ourselves to tell God what he should do. God is saying, you're putting too many limits on me and I want to do so much more. I'm taking you outside of the limits. Shout, he's leaving the limits. He's leaving the limits. He's taking us outside of the limits that we've been up under for so many years, and he's pressing us to walk into a full version of what he has for us. Limited systems is number one. Let's push for number two. Verse 23 says this: he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" Point number two is the phrase personal limits. Say that with me. Personal limits. Jesus gets the blind man outside of the city limits and he spits on him. I read it multiple times. I tried to make sure I read it in every version I could, but Jesus literally spits on the man. And I was thinking to myself, well, Jesus, why didn't you spit in your hand first and wipe it on his eyes? But he spits on the man. And what Jesus does is he goes beyond what is socially and personally acceptable. Those boundaries that we've kind of put in place. He pushes the limits with the man. And my question for you today is that, have you ever felt that God was going a little bit too far? Like he was overstepping his bounds that you had in place for him. Like, Jesus, you're asking me for too much. You're pushing me too much. God, you're asking from me a lot right now. And it almost feels offensive. And what I wanted to tell you today, don't be offended by what God is doing in your life. Don't be offended by it, because here's the thing. When God starts pushing you, when he gets you outside of the limitations of your social thinking, he gets you outside of the limitations of your financial security, when he starts to push you, once you get outside of those areas, he is getting ready to open your eyes to something you've never seen. He wants to do something amazing in your life. So don't be offended when God is starting to ask you for stuff that you never thought you should have to give. Because if somebody else would have asked me, if someone else would have done that, I would have been upset. But since it's you, God, since it's you, Jesus, I know that you're doing something special, something great in this season, and I want to be part of it. Don't be offended when God starts to push his limits with you, because he wants to open your eyes to something. Let's push for number three. Verse 23 says this: he took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Verse 25, once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were open. His sight was restored and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Point number three, and our final point for today, is limited performance. Say that with me. Limited performance. After Jesus spits on the man, it's pretty clear, and then he lays hands on him, he asked the man an interesting question, in my opinion. He says, "Do you see anything?" To me, that question was a bit perplexing, because it almost sounds as if Jesus was unsure of what he did. But if you look at it close, it wasn't that Jesus was questioning the man's ability, because Jesus knew that he had just given him the ability. Jesus was questioning the performance of his newfound sight. And what I want you to understand is that this man hears Jesus asking the question, and now he can see something. He says, "Yes, Jesus, I can see, but it's limited. I'm experiencing it, but it's limited. It has limited function. It's not performing the way that it should. And what I wanted to express to you today is that many of us are frustrated because the things in our life are not performing. They're not doing what we think they should do. I have a marriage, but it's not good. I have children and they don't listen. I've got a job and I don't like it. I've got money, but it's not enough. Everything in my life is not performing. And oftentimes we get frustrated with God. But in this season, God is saying, listen, I want you to stay right here because I have a second touch for you. And if you go through this process with me, you will see everything clearly. I will make sure that you see the resources that I've placed in your life as a blessing. I will make you see that the wife that I gave you, the husband that I gave you, the job that I gave you, the resources I gave you are a blessing to you. And I want you to be able to see them in the vein that I've created them. He says, listen, I want you to go from the light version of life to the full version of life, because the full version of life, the one that I give you, has no limits. Listen, this word was so exciting to me and such a blessing to me as I went through it, and I pray that it has blessed you. Do me a favor, make sure you pass this word around. Make sure that you get this into the hands of people who need it, because I believe there are some people out there that need to know that God wants to take us outside the limits. Listen, I pray that we get to see each other real soon. We've got some big news coming your way next week, and I want you to stay close to us because we want you to hear about it first. God bless you, and I'll see you real soon.